books. I'm delighted to introduce our three speakers. We've got Craig Renney, the Economist and Director of Policy at New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. Welcome, Craig. We've got Eric Crampton. Eric is the Chief Economist with the New Zealand Initiative. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you.
And our third panellist is Sarah Hogan, Principal Economist of New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, NZIER. So we're really looking forward to your, as always with these panels, 5 minutes of intro remarks, and then we'll move on to the Q&A with Slido up and working and ready to take your questions from the floor. We start with you. Oh, yeah, sure.
Can do.
Sure.
Thanks so much. There's a great follow-on from yesterday. We had speakers there saying the one big lesson that they'd taken was the need for getting back to fiscal consolidation when we were finishing up the talks on Reserve Bank and the advice that should be given to the government. This morning we also heard about the need for fiscal consolidation. And boy, why weren't we hearing this 2 years ago? It's a bit of a worry. So COVID has taught me, at least, two pretty awful lessons. I don't know if they've taught you the same lessons, but they're a little depressing for me. First, when Parliament gives government a loose rein to deal with a crisis as it sees necessary, trusting that fiscal capacity will be used for necessary purposes, that flexibility will be abused. Core agencies may provide veiled and sometimes not so veiled warnings that spending is difficult to justify. But ultimately, neither they nor the Public Finance Act provide discipline. Second, New Zealand may well be in a Bob Higgs world, and we do not want to be in a Bob Higgs world. That world sucks. It means that we cannot respond appropriately to crises when the next one comes. We'll take this latter one first and then get back a bit to the former. So Bob Higgs, you might not have heard about him quite as much in New Zealand, but he was fairly prominent in the US in the 1980s. He wrote a book called Crisis in Leviathan. And the basic thesis of that book was that government does a great job in increasing spending during a crisis, as we just heard discussion on the ease of getting spending measures going during a crisis, but then it has difficulty in fiscally consolidating after the crisis. He didn't use the term fiscal consolidation. The consequence of that is a one-way ratchet effect in the size and scope of government. Ratchets up during the crisis, retrenches a little bit after the crisis. Ratchets up in the next crisis, retrenches a little bit afterwards. So it's a one-way ratchet effect. Now, I hadn't really thought that New Zealand was in a Bob Higgs world, because if you look back to the path of core crown expenditure as a fraction of GDP, the late 1990s Asian financial crisis, we had an increase in the size of government, but a substantial retrenchment, and it got back to normal levels, went back down to around 28% of GDP by around 2005, 2006. Then we had the GFC, ramps up again, but it consolidated again back to about 28% of GDP. All right, so the drill had been, crisis comes in, government responds, government retrenches, paying off the debt, getting things back in order, and there hadn't been a structural shift in the size of government consequent to these. That has not been the case this time around. Size of government increased to over 35% of GDP at the peak, and during the election campaign, the National Party promised an aspirational target of getting core crown expenditure back down to maybe 30% of GDP. It's worth putting that in context. In the 2019 first well-being budget, the grand well-being budget, the one that was going to solve every problem New Zealand has ever had or ever will have and was feted around the world, we've taken this new well-being approach. It's wonderful, it's great. Core crown expenditure were forecast for 2023 in that budget to be 28.8% of GDP. We were going to solve everything on 28.8% of GDP. Luxon has promised to aspirationally get maybe back down to 30%. And even that is being characterized, often by partisans, as dangerous austerity. I think the danger runs the other way. If everyone expects that there cannot be a retrenchment after a crisis because that retrenchment will now be cast as, in partisan terms as being dangerous austerity. You will not ever again get the kind of agreement that we had in early 2020, that government needed to be given the flexibility it needed to deal with the crisis because it could be trusted to deal with it well, and that there would be retrenchment afterwards, that it wasn't going to be a permanent structural shift. So that's lesson one. But also during the spending, there was very little control on the quality of spend. So there might have been occasional veiled warnings, but remember, we were running make-work programs funded out of debt that Parliament authorized for dealing with COVID when we had a substantial positive output gap and some of the lowest unemployment rates we've ever seen. Nothing stopped it. And in 2021, when the Treasury Secretary had given a talk on some of the lessons of COVID, lauding some of the great successes warranted on the wage subsidy scheme. In addition to what she just said about the well-accepted objectives for effective fiscal stimulus, or that it is timely, temporary, and targeted, everybody agrees on that. At the time, she also said, overall, New Zealand's fiscal response is meeting those objectives perhaps better than most. At a lot of turns, it felt as though Treasury was giving the finance minister cover for doing a lot of nastiness. Measures of fiscal impulse in the budget and economic fiscal updates seemed designed to obscure rather than enlighten, and to give Minister Robertson a way to claim that he was in fact being austere and responsible and managing the books well, because the fiscal impulse is negative. Now, all that means is he's spending slightly less than he spent last year. And last year was enormous amounts of spending, right? So it made it very difficult for those who were watching all of this to be able to, well, it was easy to frame criticisms as being partisan because our core institutions weren't standing up and providing critique of spending that was unwarranted. I've probably hit my time. I am worried about our response to the next crisis if we are unable to retrench from this one. And I'm worried that ultimately the only thing that seems to bind on spending is forcing ministries to have to fight with each other in a vote process to show whose money is most effective. As soon as that was gone with over $50 billion of debt, there was no constraint anymore, and that's pretty depressing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Great.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Renney aho. Can I start by thanking Waikato University for inviting me here for all your work in organising this conference. Anna, you can start the 5-minute clock now. Coralie and Adrian have spoken very eloquently this morning about our changing environment and changing needs. And the government has made its commitment to change clear. Cuts of up to 7.5% across public services, regardless of rising need or a rising population. Changes to tax systems that will reduce revenue by around $14.6 billion across 4 years. Cuts to public spending on public transport, the end of free prescriptions, reducing support for the sick and vulnerable through changes to welfare, and just recently, real terms cuts to the minimum wage. Spending must be pared back, says the government. Why? Because it must, says the government. Right now, New Zealand's net debt is 21.7%, actually this month, 21.7% of GDP, a level described by Standard & Poor's as modest compared with that of most highly rated sovereign peers. Debt is $4.47 billion better than forecast at December. Core Crown expenses at Haefu are forecast to decline each year as a percentage of GDP until 2028. And that's before any changes from the incoming government. That last set of figures also put our overall operating spending at $1.2 billion better than forecast again in December. This is not to say that everything is rosy in the government's accounts. It's clearly not. But it's not in crisis either. But our problem is that we're looking at the accounts to give us direction and not at need. We understand our debt to 2 decimal places, whereas we have very little, if any, understanding of how much money is actually needed to maintain services and our standard of living. We understand the costs of things, but not their value. Water infrastructure is a great example here in New Zealand. many councils across New Zealand did not invest as needed over many years as they were chasing more pristine balance sheets and lower rates bills. Hospitals had mould in the walls because the government chased accounting targets rather than meeting our health needs. In 2015, we returned very tidy government accounts. But we also became a country where 1 in 7 children lived in material poverty, meaning they had not enough food, clothes, or the other essentials of life. Until we better understand need and illustrate the consequences of failing to deliver that need, we will never solve this problem. Tax cuts can always look attractive if it's not clear what you'll be giving up to pay for them. Until 2015, Treasury used to provide an analysis of the spending needed to maintain health and education services given population and demographic change. It no longer does, and I would argue it should. It also should provide that analysis in a much wider range of areas, including transport, climate change, and housing. But understanding need will only get us so far, and this is surprisingly where Eric and I agree. It's time to better understand the value for money of our expenditure and what we receive from public services, what the true costs are of failing to invest at the right time. To quote the Auditor General, the technical phrase for our reporting in this area is rubbish. At the election, many hard-working public servants were kicked around as back-office bureaucrats without any hard analysis of what they were actually delivering for New Zealanders. Some people made bold claims about wasteful spending based upon no real assessment at all. The government's proposing to cut billions of dollars in public investment without currently providing any analysis of what this will mean for New Zealand now or in the future. Yesterday, we had lots of really good discussion about social investment. And what I think it's really talking about is a need to understand that value for money better. As the economist Danny Roderick wrote last month when he was talking about industrial policy, we need to be clear-sighted about what the objectives are. The kind of discipline that's required is the discipline of monitoring, figuring out whether what you're doing is working, and being able to move away from mistakes when they aren't working. Successful policy is not about picking winners, it's about letting the losers go. I believe there's nothing inherently right-wing about seeking better value for money in government spending. Nor is there anything inherently left-wing about investing a sufficient amount of money in public services. It's in all of our interests to get this right. But getting this right doesn't mean hitting arbitrary accounting targets. We had the pleasure of 2 former prime ministers on this stage yesterday. One of them said, we have to constantly reflect upon who we are as a people. That should extend to what we want for our public spending and our public services too. And the answer to that, unfortunately, won't be found in the Treasury accounts or in just slipping back to the way things were. It will be found in valuing things properly, assessing need correctly, and delivering things well, regardless of whether or not Obigal is in surplus. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou. I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm a health economist. Most of my work focuses on the health sector and touches on areas relevant to social policy. But the health and social sector is a major driver of what we see in Treasury's books. Still, from where I stand, what's in Treasury's books is less important than the value we get from the money being spent. And in that sense, I don't know that we're going to get the dueling economists that we were set up to be this morning. Ideally, public sector spending should get us a combination of things. One of those is a short-term return in terms of well-being. The other is long-term returns that should be a really good balance of well-being from those public services that have been sustainably funded over time, but also some productivity growth from the right kinds of investments that help to ensure that we can continue to spend when and where we need to. If we could be confident in value and we could be confident in growth, then we would be less inclined to worry about whether public spending is being dialed back at any particular point in time. But it's not clear at all that we do get good value for money from public services. Using the health sector as an example, it always strikes me as ironic that Pharmac gets raked over the coals for a lack of transparency and concerns that its process of determining the value of investments is imperfect. And I don't mean to diminish in any way the legitimate concerns that have been raised about Pharmac. But my point is that Pharmac is the only part of the health system that has any transparency at all regarding how investments are prioritized. So much so that in other parts of the sector, it isn't clear that investment prioritization is done at all. And we now need to start making some really tough decisions. One of them is about things like the role of physical infrastructure in the health system. Those who follow the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission will have noted a report that came out yesterday, which I was involved in writing, which was forecasting the expected investment pressure for physical infrastructure in the health system over the next 30 years. It's not a good picture of the future, and if we don't make some really tough decisions and radically change the way we do things, it simply will not be affordable to continue in the way we've been going. Comparing investments across sectors is even more murky. Sometimes getting the best health outcomes doesn't come from spending more on health. It might come from spending more on housing, or it might come from spending more on education. To get assurance of value, we need more cost-benefit analysis. We need more consistent use of cost-benefit analysis. NZIER has done a lot of work in this space looking at how cost-benefit analysis is used in the public sector, and it's really patchy. There's not a strong belief in the value of evaluating and appraising investments in that way. But we also need more social investment thinking to make sure that we're spending in the right places to get the outcomes that we want. Maria English gave us a great example yesterday about vulnerable people in inappropriate housing who were spending 100 nights a year in hospital, and once they were put in the right kind of housing, that was reduced to 10 nights a year in hospital. And you compare that to how the health sector might have tried and spent to achieve the same objective, and it would not have been possible. So social investment is very welcome if it returns. Another thing that might make us less concerned about the state of the books is a sense that things will balance out over time, particularly if we know that we're going into a period of lower need for spending or a period of strong economic growth. With a health system that, as Des Gorman put it yesterday, is more like a disease and injury management system with no ability to plan for the future, and with a population dependency ratio that we're moving towards, the likes of which we haven't seen since the early 60s. And I guess what I'd like to point out is that what wasn't mentioned yesterday is that while the population dependency ratio is going to be similar in numbers to what was seen in the early 60s when the boomers were children, it is fundamentally different in this very important way that in the 1960s you could spend big on health and education for children and know that you were growing human capital. It was an investment that would pay dividends. Now we're moving to a dependency ratio where the high level of spending that will be expected will be purely for well-being. Not that that's not important, but it's not going to pay productivity dividends in the long run. Now, our older people do deserve dignity and well-being, and we all need to trust, and I'm glad that the concept of trust keeps coming up. It came up yesterday, and it's come up again today. We need to trust that those things will be there in the future when we need them. In fact, at NZIER, we published a public good paper on trust and the importance of it in the health sector and the way the health sector goes about relating to other organizations, providers, between providers, and with communities. Meripeka from Whānau Ore yesterday raised this issue of trust as well. It's fundamental in our relationship with the public sector and with government. It's not just political trust. It goes much deeper than that. As Meripeka said, when people lose trust, they stop engaging with services. For economists, another concern is that they also stop engaging with systems, like the economic system that relies on people to invest in their own human capital and work. They also don't respond to incentives in the way you might want them to. Instead, they spiral into worse disadvantage and fall into hopelessness. Because of intergenerational disadvantage, hopelessness is something that a lot of our young Māori face. And as we heard in yesterday's demography session, young Māori are a growing and undeniable part of our future population and our future workforce. To fail to adequately support them to realize their potential for the sake of balancing the books would be a false economy. So instead of looking to spend less overall, we should be looking for, as Craig said, opportunities to disinvest in what doesn't work, what doesn't provide value. We need to free up funds to fund those opportunities for sustained investment in human capital where it's desperately needed. In the health sector, We urgently need this shift that we've been talking about for over 20 years to turn the system on its head, as Des Gorman would like to see, to a system that's powered by strong primary and community care and helps people to be well, not just get well when they're deeply broken. That requires more spending in the short to medium term and isn't going to save us any money on the services that we're currently spending until the longer term. We need to think creatively about systems and lose the fear that engaging with the private sector, which colours our thinking in the health sector quite a bit. As Medipeka from Whanawara said yesterday, we should be looking at who else is out there that might be able to do better than what we've had for the last 2 decades, and maybe drop this unwavering belief that government always delivers the best quality health and social services.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric, Craig, and Sarah for those introductory remarks. There are, of course, lots of very interesting questions, including the linkages between the different sessions. So they're coming through very, very strongly in this session today. And I think there will be linkages, indeed, with the session directly afterwards on infrastructure. There was a surprising amount of agreement between all of our panelists, given that their position on some aspects of fiscal management might be rather different. What I'd like to ask a question about, and I'm going to start with addressing it to Craig and Eric, and then we're going to slightly direct it towards health when we ask a similar question to you, Sarah. But Craig and Eric, you know, this issue of balancing priorities. So in some senses, you agreed on the sort of framework that we should use. We need value. We need to be doing the right things. How do we balance the priorities, though, and particularly how should the Treasury balance short-run urgent priorities with the need to ensure long-term fiscal sustainability? And I wonder if you could be quite specific about how do we balance these priorities in terms of your own perspectives. And I think that you might have some slightly different views on how we do this, even though your overall framework is similar. So short-term, long-term.
Sure.
Go
well,
ahead.
In the short run, for example, to give you a very specific example, the current government is proposing to change the CPI, the adjustment for welfare, from wages to CPI, and that will save it somewhere in the order of $700 million across the forecast period. It's planning on handing back the mortgage interest deductibility to landlords across the same forecast period. That's going to cost about $3 billion. If your proposal to balance the books or to get things back on track is to take money from some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the country, get a better plan. Because right now we're going to be taking that money, which goes into local economies, which is needed, which is not saved, is not disappearing to Aruba for a tax holiday, and we're giving that money to landlords who've already done pretty well over the past 30 years, and our rent increases are currently 4.5%, which is the second highest rate they've been on record. That's not where your priorities should lie. And I don't think that's a political decision. That's a fairly straightforward economic decision. So I think in terms of, there are very straightforward things that you can do, but underpinning all of this is a really strong need to make sure we have a long-term plan for investment and long-term plans for health and education, where we provide the kinds of certainty that allow them to do proper planning and do proper investment. And part of the problem that we've had is that we've had periods of time where health and education in particular have seen a scarcity of investment. There we had years where there was no capital investment in health. And that is what leads to this feast or famine problem in terms of delivering those public services.
Thanks. Eric?
Cool. There's a few different aspects all going on at the same time here. I'll focus down on just one to begin with. So if we're thinking about different kinds of program spend and then whether it's consistent with long-term outcomes, well, you are not going to have, or you shouldn't have, you will not have earned support for the level of taxation that's necessary to fund extensive social services if you cannot demonstrate the value that is provided by them. So if you are doing the short-term stuff right, you are building the support that is necessary for the increases in taxes that might be necessary to cover the cost of it. Now, I'm agnostic about whether some of these things wind up proving their value, but if they do, well, that's how it turns out, right? if instead you're just throwing money at stuff, which we kind of have been doing, there was a framework in place for assessing this stuff up through about 2017, then it all got thrown away effectively. The investment approach that English had set up was abandoned by Cipollone. We stopped measuring these things in terms of outcomes or against a long-term fiscal measure, and now we've got an awful lot of spending that's difficult to justify. I would push back on the framing around tax cuts versus on the incidence. On all of this stuff, it just should go down to first principles. Does it make sense to treat a business that is providing rental tenancies different from other businesses in terms of tax treatment? If it isn't on first principles, then don't do it, regardless of whether you like landlords or think that they're evil, right? Tax policy shouldn't depend on that. And similarly, if you think that the point of benefits is to make sure that people can keep up with an adequate consumption bundle, then anchor it on CPI. If for other reasons you think that it should be keeping up with other things, well, you can have it set to keep up with other things, but then you can't productivity your way out of the cost of it. So just on that one aspect, make sure that you've got the short-term spend properly justified and evaluated. Then you have the support to make sure that the long-term can sort itself out, but we sure aren't there.
Yep. Sarah, on health, you talked about it quite a bit in your initial comments, but is there a difference in how we think about the short-term and long-term priorities in health, or do you agree with Eric that you build the short-term right and the long run will sort itself out? Almost.
No, I definitely would disagree if that were what Eric meant. We need a long-term vision for health. We need to know what we're trying to get to. It takes a really long time to make changes that shift the system in the way that we've been talking about for 20 years and unfortunately haven't made a lot of progress on. And I think what's really important, not just in health, but in a lot of social sector spending as well, is that when we're thinking short-term and long-term, it's coming back to that balance that I talked about, where some of the spending is actually supporting well-being in the short term, and some of the spending is supporting productivity and economic growth. And when there isn't a lot available to spend, we should be looking for that intersection in the Venn diagram, those areas where you can spend, where it supports short-term well-being, but also will contribute something to economic growth in future, and ideally spending that is targeted to children, particularly vulnerable children, and executed in the right way could potentially achieve both of those.
Yeah, so in health, you've got that very specific example of focusing on some short-term spending, having those very long-run payoffs. I'm curious, we're thinking still in the short-term, long-term, so I know, Eric, you had some more comments on that, and perhaps to recharacterize my characterization of your comments. Do you have any comments on how we can overcome the distortion to fiscal policy priorities and short-sightedness that comes from this 3-year election cycle? So rather more specifically, can we focus in on this 3-year election cycle? Perhaps, Eric, I'll go to you first on this one.
Okay, so by that you mean just the imperative to get a spending program through to get you through the next election cycle. Well, that's how I'm hearing the question. I'm not sure if that's what you meant by it.
I think it's a question through from sliders.
Okay.
So my understanding of the question is, the 3-year election cycle, is this posing problems for short-run versus long-run coherence?
It doesn't necessarily. There are some arguments around 4-year terms. People can argue the toss over that one, but better actual metrics on the quality of the spend so that it was obvious to voters whether something that's being pitched during an election campaign or spending that's happened in the election year, if that actually stacked up, if there was a good evidential case for it, if there were targets on it. I'm thinking back, again, the well-being budget, $1.9 billion in mental health. At the time, I was asking, okay, do you have any framework for assessment? Do you even know what you're going to be spending the money on? No, they didn't. They wanted an announceable, basically, and there's nothing around it. And then it lead up to, it was still ahead of 2020, but there's even no rigor at that point, right? getting stronger rigor in that kind of public reporting so that voters don't have to just go to their trusted pundit. Right? Like right-wingers might say, oh, Crampton's right, and left-wingers might say, oh, well, Renney's right, and
You'd be surprised.
they'll both say that the other one's rubbish. But if you've got the regularized assessment coming out of the core government institutions saying, okay, here is the value for money assessment that's come up with this one. Oh, and actually, here's a big red flag because they would refuse to provide one, or they forbid us from doing one, right? If you had more of that so that voters could decide for themselves whether any of this stuff made sense or whether it was an election bribe, I think would be helpful.
Some more transparency of information, I guess, is
And rigor in the evaluation of it.
Yeah.
I mean, we largely agree on this, because I mean, the first thing I would say is, how do you get around a 3-year electoral cycle? Stop having a 3-year electoral cycle. You know, please, let's have a 4-year one or a 5-year one, because it makes, I really enjoy elections, but even I, you know, find a 3-year electoral term a bit short, and it really does mean that governments are thinking about a new term right at the start. Thomas Kalecki wrote about this many, many years ago, and he's still not wrong. Yeah. So there are, you know, please move to a new cycle in this space. But the one thing I would perhaps differ with Eric on there is that what we don't understand in that process is need. So we can make assessments of value for money about, is policy A better than policy B in an area, but actually there's an underlying level of need. And you can have a policy that's fantastic, but it's only delivering to 2 people. You're not actually addressing the need, which is to 2 million people. And so you actually need to have much better understanding of need in health and education. We have a $210 billion infrastructure gap in New Zealand, and it sort of turned up out of the blue, because we had the National Infrastructure Unit sort of turn up and say, hey, we've had a piece of work done, and this is the size of the gap. Now, we can argue about whether or not that's the right number or not, but there's a very large infrastructure gap that just appeared. We all see it. We know, every time you go to a hospital, you see it. Every time anyone walks around the streets of Wellington and sees the leaks on the roads, they see it. But no voter had information for a very long period of time about the growth in that infrastructure gap. So as well as assessing value for money, which is essential, we also should be assessing need, because that allows you to make that important trade-off. Am I going to take cash today as opposed to address that need? And if I do that, what am I going to get in the future if I address that need today? And so I think both of those things need to come together. And one final point, if I may, to Cara Lee's point, which I think was an excellent one, around whether or not an independent fiscal institution is necessary in New Zealand. I'm a long-standing supporter of an IFI in New Zealand, but I actually think one of the areas which is missing is in the post-expenditure justification of expenditure and the post-justification analysis of that expenditure, and being independent of everyone in that. And I think that's an area where we really could look at strengthening the existing fiscal institutions in New Zealand.
Thanks for those comments. Sarah, in terms of health in particular, this 3-year election cycle, does it cause particular problems in the health funding area, do you think? Do you think we need a longer election cycle, or...
I think the 3-year cycle is a problem. I think that we could go a bit longer, as Craig says, 4 years, 5 years, why not? But actually, a lot of the issues that we're talking about are 20 and 30-year issues. They're one generation to the next. And so we're never going to have an electoral cycle that's that long. So we need something else that helps governments to commit to something. And I guess as much as I'm hearing Craig and Eric agree, it ought to be possible to have some kind of cross-party agreement on what the long-term future of New Zealand looks like, because where we actually will see disagreement is not what the future should look like, but actually how to get there. But at least if we can nail down what the future looks like, and I don't think that's been done. I don't think that New Zealanders are clear on what the future looks like and how we might all agree first. And then, again, it's about the information and the accountability. How are we spending? What are we doing? What's the theory of change? What's the intervention logic for the current spending in terms of how that connects to that long-term vision?
Yeah. And of course, you know, talking about the extension of the election cycles, we're talking maybe 4 to 5 years, but of course there are countries that have leadership for much longer than that, and I'm not sure that that always brings unambiguous benefits to the country. So there are these tensions between this very sort of long-sighted potential view. The good thing is it's long-sighted. The bad thing is you've got it for a very long time, whether you like it or not.
Which, if I may, I very much agree. The only thing I'd say is that I don't think we'll get agreement on what is needed. Political parties, by definition, will disagree about what a good future looks like, and that's fine. That's democracy. That's great. But certainly a long-term view of what need is, what our population looks like, how many hospitals we need in particular places, how many schools we need in particular places. We have very little understanding right now about where we should be spending capital in the health service and the extent to which that should be in primary care or in big hospitals around the country. And I think that's where we could have a much stronger level of agreement.
So maybe we do actually disagree, because I can't see how you can quantify what is needed until you know what the end goal is. And if you don't agree on what the end goal is, then you're not going to agree on what's needed to get there.
That's one characteristic of mega projects that go wrong, right? When people disagree what the goals are, you end up with cost blow. It's because people keep changing scopes. I like to think more about frameworks for discovering what the long-term goal should be than about what the long-term goal should be. I love the idea of devolving services and delivery down to local communities within accountability frameworks, so that if they're demonstrating value in providing outcomes that the ministries would otherwise be providing and are better at it, that they wind up with the funding, and that is what emerges because they are better at delivering that value. And if they aren't, well, then that doesn't emerge. But you wouldn't want to prescribe at the outset, well, it should all be by NGOs, or it should all be by this kind of thing or the other. We should be able to agree on frameworks more easily than on outcomes.
The challenge there is then making sure that you have the performance management frameworks in that space.
Yes.
And that's a really difficult challenge and a really difficult thing to deliver. And something we don't have a great deal of experience of in New Zealand, I don't know.
We'll have to build it.
And we're running very short on time here. There are lots of interesting questions that are coming through. One I was going to quickly ask you was, is the push for current, I'm not going to let you answer it, but you can choose to answer it in your final remarks, is the push for tax cuts fiscally irresponsible in the current environment? We could go with a yes, no, but what I'd prefer to do, since we've only got a minute and a half or so remaining in this session, is, given the overall focus of this forum, which is the briefing to the incoming government, what's your 45-second key message in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of Treasury, the state of the books? What's your key message to this incoming government? Sarah, we might start with you.
I think the key message is that ultimately that long-term sustainability of services and the ability for the government to keep some space to be able to ramp things up in future crises means that right now what we should be doing is really focusing right down on the high priority areas. For me, that's young Māori, because we know the demographic shift that's about to happen, and we know that there is this long-term disadvantage that ultimately we're going to have to break the back of.
Thanks.
Cool. I would separate it out between a sort of short to medium term and then longer term. In the short to medium term, retrenching from the COVID crisis is essential. You could fairly simply, what was the percentage of GDP associated with each budget line item in the Great Wellbeing budget of 2019, and that should be the target for every budget line that's a continued one from 2019. Like, they're going to be damned whether if for 6.5% cuts or any level. You might as well get it down at least to what Ardern has promised if you're pretending to be fiscally conservative, because that wasn't a fiscally conservative budget. But from there, make sure you have a rigorous framework for assessing whether other programs within a social investment approach that they want to return to, make sure that everything is set for assessment, and especially around devolved services locally, local communities, NGOs, iwi and hapu. That'll be pretty critical.
Very briefly, because I know we're out of time. My advice would be, was to the incoming Labour government in 2017, think really hard, and then stop, go away, and then think really hard again. Because what we have is, we have a situation in which the government is proposing to do a range of things. It's made a range of promises in a range of areas. Some of those will not stand the test of time, and stop and have a think. Stop and think about whether or not actually, what is it you really want to achieve? How are you going to deliver that? And have the courage, if necessary, to say the context has changed and we actually need to do things differently because we want to achieve what I think everybody wants, which is the greater well-being of all New Zealanders.
And we've seen remarkable sort of convergence of objectives. Yes, everybody's got the same objective. Actually, quite a lot of convergence in the frameworks that all our panellists would like to think about these. There are some differences in the micro, but certainly the strong push for better analysis, more information, more transparency that helps contribute to this debate. And hopefully this panel is one of those significant contributors to this discussion. Thank you very much to our panellists for those very, very wonderful insights into a range of different areas. Thanks very much. Thank you.